Good evening and welcome to the Facebook video for Wednesday night that we are recording here at Lindsley Avenue Church of Christ. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Tonight's lesson for May the 22nd is titled 18 Questions and Answers about the Genesis Flood. I think it's important before we get into the Q&A portion of this presentation to remember where we are, especially what we have talked about in the last two classes. Now, if you have not watched the last two classes, then this would be a really good point to go back and listen to it. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the nature and limits of science and how science can have a rather difficult time coming to conclusive, fixed answers about the past. Some scientific disciplines have an easier time making precise, repeatable predictions than others do, especially about the past. Of all the scientific disciplines, astronomy is one of the most accurate, if you will, about making predictions about the past because astronomy sees the past unfold when they look into the night sky. Always remember, the light that you're seeing from the sun left the sun 93 or so million miles away about 8.5 minutes ago. So when you're looking at the sun, it's the way it appeared 8.5 minutes ago. Other scientific disciplines are not as precise about the past, making judgments and assumptions. And so it would be a good thing sometimes if science or scientists would have a little bit more humility and uncertainty when they make statements about the past. Last week, we talked about lessons that we could learn from past conflicts between science and religion. And most of that lesson was spent trying to encourage those from the religious viewpoint to have a little bit more humility, especially when we're making the Bible make statements about the natural world. Because there have been a number of situations where something pops up and seems to be discovered, and religious people will jump on it and look how it supports the cause. And it turns out either the initial report was wrong or it had been disproven, and it still gets repeated in church bulletins. The shrinking sun was an example. There was an initial report number of years ago, and so that the sun might be shrinking, and then scientists went and got more data over a longer period of time, and it wasn't shrinking. That does not stop that report from being used in books supporting a religious viewpoint, which is really a shame because, as Augustine said nearly 1600 years ago, when believers make a statement about the natural world that a non-believer knows is false, it makes the believers look foolish and reflects very poorly on the case for God, which is the whole point of this series of classes about why I believe. The last thing I want to do is to make a statement about the natural world that can be disproven or already has been disproven and have it reflect poorly upon the religious outlook and the Bible. So caution and humility are the two things to, I think, always keep in mind. It's always a good practice to do. So with that being said, let's jump into 18 questions and answers about the flood. Perhaps no other single event in the Old Testament is more important in a great way, more important yet further away from our everyday experience than the flood recorded in Genesis chapter 6. Both skeptics and believers alike have numerous questions about this cataclysmic event. Some are considered on the next few slides. Notice, some answers are merely going to be my opinions. I want to have enough humility to be able to easily say that some of these are simply opinions and my best judgment after years of looking at this question myself. So let's get started. First question, when did the flood occur? Well, the basic answer is no one knows for sure. The timing of the flood depends upon a lot upon one's view of the chronological completeness of the genealogies recorded in the book of Genesis. We'll come back to that. The chronological completeness, how complete the genealogies are that are recorded in Genesis. If the genealogies are complete, then the flood might have occurred somewhere around 2400 BC, 2400 years before the birth of Jesus, but that creates a problem. Question 1A. I will try to have some humor with that. Question 1A, what problem does that create? Well, the pyramids in Egypt are older than 2400 BC. It's hard to imagine how they would have survived a worldwide flood. Think about that for a minute. It's often said that the worldwide flood would have carved the Grand Canyon and it wiped out all evidence of anything from a previous uh, uh, existence of people before the flood, yet the pyramids somehow survive. I mean, if you look at the pyramids, yes, those blocks that make up the pyramids are huge, but a flood that could have carved the Grand Canyon would have wiped it out. A couple of other things are hard to explain as well. With that timing, notice with the timing, that's the only question here. The Egyptian language and hieroglyphics, there's a lot more of Egyptian history prior to 2400 BC. And then you would have this potential flood where 8 people survive. And then the civilization in Egypt does not have some kind of a gap between it. And when civilization simply continues, there's no 100-year point where there's nothing going on in Egypt. The hieroglyphics continue. The hieroglyphics continue. They continue to be used. So how do you have an Egyptian civilization, a flood where somebody on surviving the flood understands Egyptian history, can do all sorts of things as continue to build pyramids and monuments in the same way, and still communicate with hieroglyphics? Very difficult to see how that works. As well, Chinese written history goes back further than 2400 BC. So 2400 BC is a date that would suggest itself if the genealogies recorded in Genesis are complete from a chronological standpoint, but that creates historical problems that are rather difficult to figure out how is that going to be resolved. Next question. What do you mean by this chronological completeness of the genealogies that I've used a couple of times? Well, the answer really is just trying to ask another question, is how complete are these genealogies? Are any generations left out? Although some individuals, and I've been told this, believe that once you get a list of ancestor descendants by comparing this genealogy recorded in this part of the Bible, this genealogy recorded over here, and then this one, when you put all of them together from very different points in the past, fill it in and oh, look, I have a complete list right here, right? Then you have a complete list without any gaps. Other people believe there's no reason to force that kind of interpretation on the genealogies. When you ask yourself the question of if there is a additional people, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in this genealogy list given in 700 BC compared to this one written in 1500 BC, in that 800-year period, were people supposed to have gone with this genealogy, this list of people? And when they saw this one, would they not have thought, well, why didn't we know about these 4 people over here 800 years before? It's a difficult kind of question to think through. It is very possible, and in fact, it is the view of many Orthodox Jewish scholars. I've actually spoken to several Orthodox Jewish rabbis, that the phrase son of, this person was the son of this person, should actually be simply translated descendant of, rather than actual father-son relationship, ancestor of this person who is the descendant of this person. An example of this, a very easy example of this, is in the first chapter of Matthew. Jesus is called the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, they're actually not physical father-son. Jesus is the descendant of David, the descendant of Abraham. Now, this is not being done in any kind of attempt to shove a million years in between various people and genealogies, but you have situations where the genealogies do not appear to be consecutive, father-son kind of relationships. You have this kind of a situation from the book of Matthew. And if you do have a complete list and you insist upon the viewpoint that they are father-son, you run into the pyramid problem. Well, what are some of these gaps? Well, compare the listing when you get a chance in Ezra chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, and the listing given in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. The account in 1 Chronicles gives 6 extra names between Marioth and Azariah when you compare that to the listing in Ezra. So what do you do with these 6 extra names? Another example is found in Genesis chapter 10 and Luke chapter 3. Genesis 10, 21 through 24, and Luke 3, verses 35 through 36. Luke inserts a son named Canaan between Shem and Shelah, who is not listed in Genesis chapter 10. So what does that mean, right? Does that mean that from the time of Moses receiving the book of Genesis to Luke, no one knew who this Canaan was? And then if somebody sees this extra son, the natural reaction would be, well, this guy named Luke writing this genealogy over here from this new group called Christians doesn't even know the genealogies. Look at that. They're thinking that Luke would have made a mistake by shoving in this Canaan that we've never heard of for 1,500 years. If it is assumed that the listing in Genesis and other places is a direct father-son kind of relationship. When you compare as well Matthew chapter 1, verse 8 and 1 Chronicles 3, Matthew's list has 3 fewer people in it than the list in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Personally, I think the reason Matthew does that is because Matthew's very, very focused on 14, 14, 14. Matthew's list of the genealogy is a trick rabbis often used is to help things be more easily remembered by getting them all into the same kind of pattern, 14 descendants, 14, 14. It's kind of like what we do when we help children learn the books of the Bible by singing them to an easy to remember song. And as long as you can remember the way the song goes, then you can more easily remember the books as you're trying to learn them. Same thing would have been true here in the past. Now, here's the next question. Well, are you saying that these gaps in the genealogies make the genealogies wrong? Are you saying that because Luke has an extra person in it that was not there in the past, and Ezra and Chronicles have a different list of people, are you trying to suggest that the genealogies are wrong? Well, what I'm stating is that the genealogies are different. Go read them yourself. The genealogies are different. I am not saying that they are wrong. These gaps do not make the genealogies wrong. It simply appears that at times the biblical writers simply noted important or memorable ancestors in a family tree rather than each individual. It has to be something like this, or the genealogies would be different. And I just don't think that the approach to this is to take every genealogy over a 1,600 year historical period and fit in everybody and get, oh, now today, this is the real genealogy with everybody put in it. When Jewish individuals and Jewish scholars and rabbis from 1300 BC to 600 BC would never have seen this name that is recorded in a writing in 60 AD by Luke. I think the reason why these genealogies are listed the way they are is it simply depends upon the purpose or use of the list. We approach things from the 21st century standpoint where we are very interested in precision. We have computers and we've had handheld calculators that can give you an answer to something to the 10th decimal point. And that is a modern view of precision and accuracy. These genealogies are not wrong. They were simply used the way they were intended. And we are the ones jumping back into history and seeing these lists and using them for a purpose in a way that is different from the way they originally were. I don't believe anyone from the time, whether it's 800 BC, if you were able to talk to someone, 400 BC in the time between the Testaments, or 80 AD would have looked at these things and thought anything about them, but they are different. And that brings into question how complete they are in terms of trying to reconstruct times and chronologies looking into the past. As I say, it seems that we have these questions when we impose a 21st century idea into something that was perfectly accepted in the past. Well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal, Gene? What's the big deal with these genealogies and the gaps you're talking about when they have to do with when the flood occurred? Well, the problem is prior to the time of Abraham or Abram, there is no easy way to date events recorded in the book of Genesis without attempting to use these genealogies. Abraham is where the record of the Old Testament, the record of biblical history, comes into play to where we can see events outside of the Bible and date things. We know Abraham is roughly around 2000 BC, but prior to that, it's very, very difficult to say, when did this happen? When did this happen? Without using these genealogies. And so if these genealogies are in fact not chronologically complete, remember Luke puts in an additional person that's not in the genealogy of the events right after the flood, all the way over in 60 or so AD, whenever the book of Luke was written. So therefore, using these genealogies to date things into the past is going to be problematic. If you take these genealogies to be without gaps, which I know a lot of people do, then Noah is still alive at the time of Abraham. Write it out yourself. And that is not what you would expect. Abraham hears the call of God. Well, if Noah's still alive in, a house up on a hill somewhere, Abram could have tried to track down Noah and said, when God spoke to you, is this what it was like? More strange, if you will, for this, Adam would have still been alive when Noah's father was alive. As Noah, right before the flood, Adam is still hanging around. He's still alive. He's still there when Noah's father was living. These associations, Noah being alive when Abraham is, Adam being alive when Noah's father is, seem very counterintuitive and out of place. When you get to the time of Noah, Adam seems like it's a long, long time prior to that. When you get to the time of Abraham, Noah seems like it has receded into the past. It seems counterintuitive. Maybe that's because they were not contemporaries at all. They simply appear to be contemporaries by us looking at the genealogies and stringing them together and saying, aha, look at that. Abraham and Noah were contemporaries for a few years. All right, switch gears here. That may have been a hard way to start the class, but switch gears. Question 6. What evidence outside of the Bible is there for the flood anyway? Well, actually, there's quite a bit of cultural evidence for the historicity of a very large flood. Most cultures, a great number of cultures spread all over the world, have a flood story. These stories relate how the world was destroyed by a flood and only a few survived by building a large boat. Consider this list of peoples that have a flood story and note how spread over the globe they are. In the area of Asia, the Assyrians and the Babylonians have a flood story. The Japanese and the Mongols and the Persians and the Phoenicians all had a flood story. In Africa and Polynesia, you have the Fijians, the Micronesians, the Egyptians, the Melanesians, the Hawaiians, the South Polynesians. In the Americas, the Aztecs, the Cherokees, the Mayans, the Incas, and the Toltecs. In Europe, the Germans, the Greeks, the people living in Iceland, Lithuanians, the Norse, and the Romans. These stories are not exact copies, replicas of the story of the flood that's in the Bible. They do not have an individual named Noah, but they have a very similar overall picture of a flood that nearly wipes out all of humanity and only a few people survive. It's hard to imagine how these cultures that had very little common interaction for a long, long time, when would have been the last time the people in Fiji would have been able to interact with the Romans, for example, and yet still have this similar kind of story without some kind of event in the past that collectively, culturally, we all have in common. Next question, question 7. Did the flood actually cover the entire earth? Well, according to the book of Genesis, it sure looks like it did. The language in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 6, is descriptive of universal destruction of everything that lived on the earth. If the flood had been local, then why didn't God just have Noah move to Australia? After all, Noah did have over 100 years' notice that a flood was coming. The answer to that I've heard some people give is that God wanted the ark to be built as a way of preaching to people around them. Even again, if Noah could have simply gotten onto some caravan and moved far enough away that he would have been out of the way of a local flood. That's hard to see how that makes sense. The language of Genesis does sure look like it's describing a universal flood. Question 8, what physical evidence is there for a flood? Actually, that's a tough question. Some would say that there's physical evidence almost everywhere around us, and others say there's very little physical evidence left over from the flood. Question 9, well, what does that mean? Well, some individuals have a belief in what's called flood geology, which in which most physical traits of the earth today were caused by the flood. This would include almost all fossils having been laid down by the flood. I've already mentioned the Grand Canyon, etc. The physical appearance of the earth is, to a great extent, explained by the flood for those who believe in this flood geology. As I say, it really does tend to explain most of the ways that our world looks like today. Those who believe in this theory see the evidence of fossil severe erosion, Grand Canyon, and believe these are the result of the flood. Question 10, since I brought up flood geology, is flood geology correct then? Well, again, that's a tough question. There are quite a few problems with the theory of flood geology. For example, there are rock formations containing fossils that have multiple layers of fossils. And the issue is sometimes the nature of the fossils in this vertical column of fossils all come from different types of environments. You might have tropical fossils, you might have desert fossils and woodland fossils. It's very difficult to see how these layers of fossils could be laid down like that during a flood. It's very difficult to explain how you could get environmentally, geographically sorted fossils in a layer, all in the chaos of a global flood. The sheer quantity of fossils in some areas is also very hard to explain if they were all formed during the flood. They just appear to be in some locations way too many fossils. I mean, would you have had, I'm making this up, but would you have had 1 million rabbits all living in the same half acre when you get huge fossil graveyards? It's just hard to understand how you would have that many fossils in certain places. Do note this, however. Someone who questions flood geology is not questioning the Bible. This theory is proposed to explain the natural world from an event recorded in the Bible. Remember the previous classes. It's an attempt to propose an explanation of something the Bible talks about in the physical world. And a little humility is probably necessary in case flood geology is not correct. It's also important to know that when you're making a prediction about something, for it to be a scientific theory, it can't simply explain what you see. You have to be able to make predictions and account for all sorts of other likely things that don't mesh exactly with the theory. But really important, if you run across somebody who says, I don't know that I believe in flood geology, don't stagger back and say, well, that means you don't believe the Bible. Not at all. Flood geology is in a way to explain the event of the flood in one way. It is not an attack on the Bible itself. The Bible itself does not mention flood geology. The Bible mentions the flood. What do you do with that is what we're trying to interpret and what people are looking at. Well, you've talked about people, question 11, who don't believe in flood geology. Well, what do they believe about the flood then if they don't believe in this flood geology? Well, generally, those who do not believe in flood geology would say that the flood undoubtedly created some fossils. I mean, if you've got a flood of the type that's being discussed here, lots of movement would have been going on. Lots of erosion would have occurred. Lots of mud and other sediment would have been moved around, and that would have covered up some animals. So you would have certainly have gotten some fossils out of the flood as it's recorded, but they would tend to believe that it was not responsible for the large-scale structure and transformation of the earth, such as a Grand Canyon or something else. Many of these individuals would point out to those who follow flood geology that fossils typically need calm conditions to form. And that's not exactly how you would picture a catastrophe like a global flood. Not believing in flood geology does not believe that one does not believe in the flood or that one questions the Bible. Let's be sure to equate an explanation that's being given to explain something the Bible talks about with the Bible itself. Did the flood, here's one I always like, kids like to ask this one. Did the flood leave that shell I found outside my house in Tennessee? I remember as a very young boy, my parents added on a room to the house. My brother and I did not know that's because my sister was coming to the scene. And as they were digging, we found tiny little shells. So I'd ask Mom, hey, did that come from the flood? Well, the answer to that is probably not. Sometimes people have wondered whether the flood put seashells up in the high mountains or left them inland. There really was not enough time during the global flood to see animals move far enough inland to live and die in sufficient quantities to produce a layer after layer of seabed fossils that are found in many areas that are far away from shorelines. David Lipscomb said this. I bring up a quote from David Lipscomb from 1899 in the Gospel Advocate, because whatever you may think of David Lipscomb, and he was one of the early elders at the church that is now Lindsley Avenue, he was hardly some kind of modernist. He was hardly some sort of supporter of evolution, and took the integrity of the Bible and the written word very strongly. If you're going to dismiss things that David Lipscomb said, you've got to really have some really good reasons, because he knew the text, I would suspect, better than most of us who are alive today. So here's what he said. Listen carefully to what he said. For a great while, people saw the remains of shells and sea animals embedded in the rocks of our highest mountains, as well as through the broad plains of the earth. And they took this as clear evidence that the waters of the flood covered this land and our highest mountains and the great masses of the layers of rocks, stratified rocks, with their shells, and the embedded remains of water animals were deposited by the waters during the flood. Listen carefully. A serious study of the facts would have satisfied anyone that all the deposits with their fossils could not have taken place during the prevalence or time of the flood. Doesn't sound to me as if David Lipscomb would have been a believer, a follower of flood geology. And where I have the dot, he actually was a bit harsh there, but he says it would have satisfied anyone, and in fact, he says with common sense. Kind of a hard statement, but he certainly did not believe in flood geology. Would we say then that this means that Lipscomb did not believe in the flood? Absolutely, that is false. Would it have meant that Lipscomb didn't believe in the integrity of the Bible? That is absolutely false. It's something to keep in mind. Well, where did that shell come from then? If the shell may not have come from the flood described in the Bible, why is there a shell in my backyard? Well, it was probably left there sometime when the area was found under a calm body of water for a long time. That's what typically happens. When did that happen? Nobody knows for sure. The timing of things before Abraham is very difficult for the reasons we have been discussing here. Question 14. Where did all the water for the flood come from? Well, the answer to that is, since God brought about the flood by a miracle, there really is not a need to speculate on natural sources of where the water came from, or even where the water went. It was a miracle. However, that hasn't stopped some people from trying. I'm going to give 6 possible sources for the water. I'm not going to put any credence in any of these over any of the others, because God brought about the flood as a miracle. If God wanted to effectively snap fingers and have the water poof show up and rain as long as it did, perfectly fine with me. I am not in any way suggesting that these sources for the water are things that we really necessarily even need to consider. Number one, a magnetic field reversal. It's possible that a collapse of the Earth's radiation belts could put a great deal of hydrogen from the charged particles into the atmosphere, and if they combined with water, with oxygen, they could form water. Really no way to test that, so that's simply something that one person has put forth. Canopy theory. A collapse of the canopy, water canopy surrounding the Earth, we'll talk about that in a minute, would produce large amounts of water. Geological aquifers, if there were, in fact, large sources of underground water, they could have provided water for the flood. We don't really know where there's enough water under the Earth like that to do that. The next one, a comet or asteroid impact, a collision of a large icy object with the Earth, an asteroid or comet. The question there is, where's the result of that impact? The melting of the polar ice caps would certainly provide quite a bit of water. I mean, after all, right? That is what we are told to be very worried about these days in the news with the subject of climate change, that the ice caps are melting. But even if all of them melted, that would not be enough water to cover the entire Earth, assuming that the mountains are as high now as they were 3,000-4,000 years ago. And finally, miraculous creation by God. So you can look into these different possible sources for the water if you want. There probably are some other ones out there as well. I won't give them any more time than that, primarily because the flood is recorded as a miracle. and God could certainly do whatever he wanted to do. Well, what was that canopy theory? I've heard of that before. Well, the canopy theory proposes that in the time of Adam through Noah, the earth was covered by a water vapor canopy. This theory states that the canopy provided an environment where the earth was a tropical paradise and where people would have been shielded from harmful rays or radiation from the sun, thereby living potentially much longer. As attractive as this theory sounds, there's no scientific explanation for how a water vapor canopy could remain in place. It would have required a constant miracle to keep that water vapor canopy surrounding the earth if it was ever there. But the problem is, miracles, by their very definition, are an exception, not the rule. We like to talk about that all of life is a miracle. We'd like to talk about each day is a miracle, but miracles are unique things that are not common. One of the reasons that the miracles of Jesus provided such a shock value is because they weren't things that were happening all the time. And so if you have God maintaining outside, if you will, of the laws of the universe, God's certainly able to do. But if you have God doing that, he's doing a miracle, 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 miracle constantly, which again is hard to understand why. It's also, I think, based on a dubious interpretation of waters above the firmament. I think that the waters above the firmament almost certainly were the clouds. When you look at commentaries, you'll find that talked about a lot. People have seized upon it because the water vapor canopy provides not only waters for the flood, but can help explain the differences in lifespan before and after the flood. And so it's a real convenient explanation without a lot of other support that will be helpful for it. And so the reason I bring that up is that it's probably not something that should be used to explain the flood or conditions in the past. And one of the young earth creation organizations, Answers in Genesis, agrees with that. So if somebody is saying that the canopy theory probably should not be used, again, don't look at them and say, well, they're not believing the Bible, or they're obviously trying to maintain that evolution is how everything came about. You can't trust anything this woman says because they don't believe in the canopy theory. Go to the Answers in Genesis website if you wish and search for canopy, water vapor canopy, and you'll see they suggest not using it. Some groups, religious groups, do use it. Other prominent ones do not. So it doesn't sound like it's orthodoxy as to whether you accept that or perhaps don't accept it. Question 16, have they found Noah's Ark, or will they ever find Noah's Ark? I know you've got the Ark exhibit. That's not what we're talking about here. That's pretty easy to find if you've got a GPS. Will they ever find the original Noah's Ark? Well, first of all, they have not found it yet, despite websites you may have, despite reports by anesthesiologists who became amateur archaeologists and seem to have found anything and everything. And despite movies in search of Noah's Ark and things like that, they have not found it yet. And it is not because the government of Turkey is keeping people from looking for Noah's Ark. Will they ever, question 16a, will they ever find Noah's Ark? That's hard to say, but listen to me carefully. I'd be inclined to say no. I really don't think they're going to find Noah's Ark. First, looking on Mount Ararat is probably a mistake. Genesis says that the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. So if we're going to be looking at what the biblical text says, Mount Ararat likely is not the place that it landed on in the first place. Second, there's also a high likelihood that the ark may have been destroyed over the last several thousand years due to snow, ice, and weathering effects. Sure, some wood can become petrified, but that's under very specific conditions. If I left a piece of wood out in my yard and it sat there for several thousand years, it likely wouldn't look a whole lot like wood, given insects and other pests. Third, if the ark had not been destroyed, imagine again, after the flood, with things having been wiped out, we need places to live. We want to build some things. Well, look over there. There's a huge amount of wood already here. So disassembling the ark would have made a great deal of sense to potentially rebuild cities and build places to live. So I really don't think that the ark has been found. There's no evidence that it's been found, and I don't think it really ever will. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. Don't take it that way. Just because I can't find it doesn't mean it wasn't there. Question 17. Could Noah have actually carried all the animals on the ark? Well, be careful about the terms we use. Remember, Noah was not told to take two of every living animal species onto the ark. That's a modern scientific term. Genesis 6:20 states two of every sort of animal. And we're not particularly sure what that means. Again, we're taking after the industrial revolution, the scientific revolution, the development of biology in the terms of kingdom, phyla, and all these different classifications, and we're trying to put that back into a historical document here, recording what happened and trying to make it fit. And it's not going to be a very good, accurate fit. It would reduce quite substantially the number of animals required on the ark, depending on whether it was two of every species or two of something a little higher up, where you then had some fill out beneath it. But the other thing is, we really don't realize just how big the ark is. Now, we realize it better today, I think, with the ark exhibit. It's a monstrously enormous boat, right? Was there anything special about the size or dimensions of the ark? Well, yes, the dimensions recorded were sure effectively 450, 75, 45, 450, 75, and then 45 tall. Turn out to be the exact relationship that provides a great deal, perhaps the highest level of stability for a sea vessel. You see, it's very near the scale that's used for those large oil tankers. You know how they're so long, they're wider, and they're not as tall as that kind of dimensions. Those kind of dimensions provides a great deal of stability when you're on waters that are going to be rather chaotic. Remember, the waters were said to be incredibly chaotic, and you don't need a raft if you need something that's going to have a lot more stability if the waters were as chaotic as we are told by some individuals, especially if it's carving the Grand Canyon. However the flood waters behaved, the dimensions recorded were very, very calming for the passengers on the ark. I don't think it's luck that Noah just happens to come up with dimensions that are very close to what's used for oil tankers. No, it's not luck at all. God is the one describing how to build the ark. Conclusion. Listen, there are a number of things that we do not and may never know about the flood. Again, many of these answers that I've been giving to these questions are because I get asked these questions, and some of these are my opinions and what I think. Take that for what it's worth. Nothing I have said in here should be in any way viewed as a criticism of the biblical record. Far from it. Not at all. Nothing I have said in here should suggest that I don't believe what the Bible says. Remember the statement of David Lipscomb that I read earlier. There's a great deal of some dogmatism that can show up because we don't have humility as often anymore about how we explain things. We like precision. We like knowing everything. And uncertainty and being willing to have things where we don't know all the answers, I think is a good approach to take. The historicity of an event like the flood, however, cannot be denied, really should not be denied, given the number of cultures scattered over the globe with flood stories. There's some event in the past that has caused all these cultures living all over the world to have a cultural memory of an event like the flood. The creator of the universe certainly has the power to remove all living things off of the face of the earth if he so chooses. He's done it once before, and the promise that's been made in the New Testament, Jesus made it and the apostles made it, is that some point in the future, he will do it again. Those are my questions and answers about the Genesis flood. I want to thank you for being here with the class. We will be moving into a series of lessons as we end the class where we look at Genesis chapter 1. Remember, this goal of this class has been to bring someone who does not believe along the path of showing why it's reasonable to believe. The flood is something that will eventually come up. It makes no sense to talk about the flood until after someone is a believer. Certainly the same thing with Genesis chapter 1. So if we've talked about the flood, well, what do we do with Genesis chapter 1? We'll be looking at that here in the coming weeks. I want to thank you for being in the class and hope to see you again next week.